Good. So we're very, very happy to welcome Simon Conway Morris this morning. He's just back. He's telling me from another conference held in the Vatican Observatory in Rome, where it's also pretty warm down there. So very grateful to him for coming over from that conference. Simon holds the chair in evolutionary paleobiology here in Cambridge. He's in the Earth Sciences Department, and he's been there since 1995. And you'll be hearing more about his research soon. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1990. He's had very numerous awards and medals for his work, including in 1998 the Lyell Medal of the Geological Society of London, and has also appeared on many programs on TV and also in radio. And as a book particularly that you should look out for on the bookstall, which is reduced, although it's, I have to say, not the cheapest book we've got on the bookstall, but it's certainly worth the money. And this is Life's Solution: Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe. I do hope that if you can afford it, you'll be able to buy that book. It's a great read. So Simon's going to speak to us this morning on Does Evolution Have a Directionality, Even a Destination? Thank you very much, Simon.
Good morning. Thank you, Dennis, very much for those nice comments. And good morning to a characteristically cool Cambridge. I don't think most of us are enjoying this sort of weather at all, but I'm not going to be talking about climate change, but if I was, then I can assure you I would terrify you. It's not looking too good at the moment, I have to say, but this may just be a glitch, as I say. In any case, it's a great pleasure to be here. Dennis mentioned that there can be questions, and I'll be very happy to join that panel discussion this evening. But I should say that when, especially if English isn't your first language and somebody like myself is cantering along, as we say, talking very fast, if there's something which is completely obscure, in fact that's extremely likely, then please interrupt. Now I believe I've got 2 hours of speaking, and at exactly 4 minutes past 10 I shall stop in mid-sentence, and then we'll start again after coffee in that mid-sentence and carry on, if that's okay. Because there's Oh, even better, right, okay, so, but you'd like 60 minutes at the moment, roughly. Fine, okay. So there's a structure to the talk, but it may not be quite as clear where I'm heading until later on in the morning, in that respect. So then, just to kick my discussion off, this is a slide which I borrowed from the European Space Agency, which have a very exciting program of extraterrestrial exploration, a Mars Express, of course, and now the probe to Venus. And I think it captures very nicely, really, the way scientists are poised, in a sense, between the planet we live on, which has more than 4 billion years of history, going from a beginning as part of the formation of the solar system, and one which has changed very, very dramatically through time. So from a geological perspective, actually, the global warming we're presently undergoing, in fact, we reran that tape 55 million years ago, as it so happens. I could tell you all about that. It's a very interesting episode, and that's one reason why some people at the moment are pretty pessimistic about what's happening, because what happened 55 million years ago was not too good, and we're basically putting the same amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere in the next 100 years as happened 55 million years ago, and we know exactly what happened. So trust scientists sometimes. On the other hand, of course, we now know that we live in an immeasurably, more or less, large universe, and one of the chief speculations, of course, is whether there's any other sort of sentient life there. And this is obviously a matter of great scientific interest, but it's also, as I think a number of people have pointed out, a question which is much, much more interesting with respect to theology, because after all, sentient beings, so far as we know, are the only sorts of object in the universe which have a religious instinct, at least on this planet. And there are indeed very interesting science fiction books which attempt to explore what happens when you arrive on a planet where, for example, there is no sin. There's a rather splendid book in that context. So from a scientific viewpoint, and again, I realise many of you will not be scientists, there's a great deal to play for at the moment. There is also, I should say in parenthesis, and whether I get back to that at the end, I'm not so sure I have time, but the idea, of course, is that science eventually will be able to explain absolutely everything. As we say in England, ha, ha, ha. That's not very likely, in fact. But there is a very interesting question as to what the limits of science might be, or indeed whether there are areas of which science will never be able to explain anything, which I actually think is rather unlikely, but that's because we don't fully understand what science is, I suggest, and whether in fact the possibility is that science is almost a completely open-ended enterprise. But I say, by the word science, I'm using it in a much wider sense than perhaps some of the technocrats would be presently referring to. So that's a little bit of the background. Now, I originally trained as a geologist and then a paleontologist, so studied fossils and things like that. But these days I'm more or less an evolutionary biologist, though of a rather amateurish sort. And nearly everything I'll be talking about is based on other people's work, which actually gives me particular security because I find other people's work far more reliable than my own, as it so turns out. But nevertheless, if there are expert biochemists here, well, Dennis is one, of course, they'll know that I'm going fast and loose over a lot of very complicated data. But by way of background, first of all, assuming that there is life elsewhere in the universe, and it was extremely odd if there wasn't, though actually it may be that there is no life anywhere else, perhaps. But if there is, then we are reasonably sure at the moment, which means that we may be proved tomorrow, speaking scientifically, that it will be based on carbon. There are other possibilities, of course, but carbon-based life form seems to have particular utility, if you like, and in addition, in combination, the universal solvent is water. Now again, there are alternatives, and it may be we're too narrow-minded, but at the moment there do seem to be particular advantages of that system, at least in certain temperature ranges. On much colder planets, in fact, there may be very different systems, but that's very much a matter of speculation. Now, in addition to that, there is some reason to think that the basic biochemistry, and here I've chosen the icon of molecular biology. This, of course, is the famous double helix, whose structure, of course, was resolved just down the road in the old Cavendish laboratories by Crick and Watson. DNA, as it happens, is a very, very odd molecule indeed. It's actually a very nice example of what's referred to as emergence, whatever that means. I'm never quite sure, whereby the basic building blocks in their own way are pretty unremarkable. And, they're quite interesting, purines, pyrimidines, phosphate and that sort of thing. But when they come into combination, the resultant helix, chemically, not in terms of replication, but chemically, is remarkably different from what you'd predict. It's got all sorts of conformations and flexibilities, which I think would be very unlikely to be ab initio predicted on the bench of a chemist, but to the biochemist, of course, it's familiar. But the net result of all this is that there is some suggestion that, in fact, the biochemistry of the universe may well be more or less universal. Now, this is a rather extravagant claim, and again, scientists enjoy making extravagant claims because their colleagues usually enjoy proving them wrong in due course, and this is mostly a matter of friendly rivalry. But again, unless you're a scientist, I don't want to overemphasize this, but although I'm very interested in theology, I think it's very important to understand, in a sense, what the dynamic of science is, and although it has some very frightening aspects to it, nevertheless, it is a method of human inquiry, which is very, very odd indeed. And once you learn how to do it, it's rather easy, but from the outsider, it can seem almost like magic. It's not at all. So with respect to the biochemistry, the uniqueness perhaps of DNA, but more particularly many of the building blocks which were necessary for us to be alive, we now know can be readily synthesized in conditions very, very far removed from what the Earth presently enjoys. In other words, in interstellar clouds, a substantial inventory of organic molecules are readily constructed in practically zero conditions, near vacuum condition, shielded in certain ways. And in fact, the argument is that a substantial amount of what makes us alive was delivered to the Earth by comets and asteroids very early in the history of the Earth, and then the origin of life actually began on a planetary surface, which is very different indeed from present-day circumstances. That's by no means the only possibility. There are others. I'm not going to talk about the origin of life at all. It interests me very much indeed, but it's really not something which we have time for. So, there is the possibility that biochemistries are possibly something which are, if not ubiquitous, very widespread indeed. That, however, does not seem to apply to the rest of the history of life. And it's captured rather nicely in this splendid diagram, a painting from a Japanese museum near Osaka. Now, as you can see, the artist has tactfully left out the origin of life. Very sensible indeed. And what it shows us a whole lot of things. And again, people like Stephen Jay Gould made a great song and dance about the iconography of science. I think it has some point, but there is a great deal of information one can readily transmit in something which apparently is rather artless. So what we have here is in the bluish zone, and all these sort of blobs here are forms of microbial life, bacteria, and single-celled forms like euglena and amoeba and so forth. And one of the puzzles about the history of life is that for something like 70 to 80% of its duration, seemingly very little indeed happened. There was life, certainly. We have good evidence of life back to 3.5 billion years. Most people now accept that. But thereafter, evolution seems to have gone along at a metaphorical snail's pace. And this is rather puzzling, I think, because to the first approximation, evolution is not exactly a runaway process, but it is a matter of competitive advantage. And if you are slightly better at doing something, like growing an eye, then it's very much in your interest to grow an eye. And if you don't want to be looked at, it's very much in your interest to be able to run away. So, you know, there's a sort of arms races of one sort and the other. Well, maybe the fossil record is less complete than we would like, but I still find this rather puzzling that we have such a period of relative evolutionary inactivity. The answer, I suspect, lies in the surface conditions of the Earth, which were not conducive to the development of more complex forms, which is more or less, and again I'm simplifying here, though it's an area I'm very interested in professionally, is more or less synonymous with the so-called Cambrian explosion. So here we have in the yellowish zone this whole panoply of different creatures. We have seaweeds, we have fungi, we have plants, and we have animals here. And so we have elephants and sperm whales. And here you can see this individual here with his underpants still on, I'm pleased to say, just by the kingfisher. And the basic argument amongst neo-Darwinists has been that all of this is one glorious evolutionary accident. And from a scientific viewpoint, it's very difficult to speak against that outlook, because after all, we know that history is full of twists and turns. There are all sorts of ways in which it might actually go in unexpected directions. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And the reason why this is so important is, of course, it suggests that our particular sentience in particular is also an evolutionary accident. I'll show actually in due course this is complete rubbish, as it so happens, and this can be shown scientifically. But amongst neo-Darwinians in particular, a very important corollary of that has been, and I believe somebody was talking about this yesterday, is that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, at least an intelligence analogous to human intelligence, is a complete and utter waste of time. You know, don't give SETI any money, because they'll be pointing at telescopes for no purpose at all. Because there may be other sorts of organism out there. There may be huge sheets of slime crawling all over distant continents, blah de blah de blah. But that's neither here nor there. You know, something here who is able to engage in rational discourse is an evolutionary fluke. Well, again, any of you who've got training or interest in metaphysics can immediately see this is an extremely suspicious supposition to begin with. But it is something which very much underlies neo-Darwinian thinking, and so people, including not only Stephen Jay Gould, most famously with his rerunning of the tape of life, but in addition such people as Jared Diamond or George Gaylord Simpson, this is very much part of the received wisdom. And indeed, when we look, and I do apologise for showing this particularly revolting individual, when we look at history, there's been a great deal of interest in the last 15 or 20 years on so-called counterfactuals. Supposing we were to rerun the tape of life or the tape of history. And as you can see, this is the title of this one is What If? I'll show you its sequel much later on. Military historians imagine what might have been. And in the particular case of my own country, of course, one likes, fortunately, not to speculate what would have been the consequence if Hermann Goering had continued to insist that the Luftwaffe attack the English air bases rather than diverting the efforts of that malign air force to the bombing of the English cities. And all of you have your own histories, either in this country or elsewhere. In America, the winning of Gettysburg by the Confederates is one which entertains a lot of people, including the English, actually. A counterfactual there would be quite fun. I particularly like this one here, because here we have some of the Battle of Britain pilots with their famous Spitfires and Hurricanes, and his famous quote by Churchill, the Prime Minister, and I'll try not to get the accent too wrong, never was so much owed by so many to so few. Thank you. But of course, these are a crowd of jokers. And remember, many of these people were 19 or 20, astonishingly young and brave individuals. Not to say they weren't corresponding individuals in the Luftwaffe, they most certainly were, but I say their purposes were almost entirely malign. But the joke in the RAF was, in fact, this never was so much owed by so many to so few. In fact, they were probably referring to their bar bills rather than to anything else. But Dennis kindly mentioned there is an alternative view, and those of you who are Americans, I believe there are a number here, will understand that the constant self-advertisement and self-publicity of all academics is nicely shown in this diagram, where I modestly draw attention to my own tiny efforts here. But though I won't be talking in detail, but I'm more than happy to justify it as best I can, I think that from an evolutionary perspective, the emergence of something very akin to a human is basically inevitable. I think the evidence for that is now very strong indeed. But paradoxically, there is some reason to think we might actually be alone, which is slightly ridiculous, because the point about evolution, of course, is, and science generally, is it's there to make predictions. By and large, one's looking for generalities. And one should say in passing, of course, this is one of the problems of biology in comparison with physics and chemistry. Biology has been more or less sort of regarded as a pretty well an unholy mess. There's loads of exceptions. I mean, it's great fun if you're a natural historian, but if you want to study the periodic table or the structure of gravity or something like that, then you become a chemist or a physicist. Right, on to the real stuff now. By way of background, because I will be talking about the evolution of the eye in due course in a little bit more detail, one argument which is being put forward for why so far, famous last words, as the flying saucer descends onto the lawn outside, but so far we have not detected any signs whatsoever of extraterrestrial life. And there are other tests merely than just putting your ear to the sky, by the way, is that in fact life is ubiquitous. It forms very easily because the natural assembly of these building blocks, which I referred to already, that may well be the case, but complex life is much, much more difficult to evolve. There are all sorts of barriers, and in particular the idea that planets have to be exceptionally stable. Now, there may be some truth in that, but the argument put forward in the book Rare Earth, which some of you may have read or know about, it's a very fine book. I think it's written in a nice, jaunty and accessible style. Their argument was effectively that it's very, very unlikely that complex life occurs anywhere else except probably the Earth. Every other planet which can allow life to survive just has what, again, with great respect, the Americans call pond scum, just this sort of green slime on rocks and pools and so forth. But in fact, the bulk of the complexity of advanced organisms, as encapsulated with, of course, the type Darwinian example. And by the way, I should say, if there's any sort of residual doubt, although I have criticisms of some aspects of neo-Darwinism, I am a neo-Darwinian, so don't get it, just in case you think you're going to see some confessional area. Yes, sorry.
Can you speak slowly?
I will try to, yes, certainly, yep. But we have a great deal to get through, but I shall try and speak slowly, sure. Thank you, no. The aspects with respect to the emergence of complex forms is that most of the building blocks are actually ready and available long before the complex structure itself has evolved. So in the case of the eye has to do a number of things, of course, but principally it's got to be transparent with the lens, and it's got to have a receptor system at the back with the retina, which enables the proteins, well, the opsins in particular, to make a transduction of photons into an electrical signal. And it turns out, and I can give you the details if you're interested, but both of those proteins used to confer crystallinity to the lens, transduction to the retina, have both evolved long before there were any eyes. In other words, they are there ready and waiting to be employed as and when necessary. And that applies to various other aspects of our nervous system, for example. So simply to say a brain is very difficult to evolve is difficult to accept from a biochemical perspective. Brains should actually be quite easy to evolve because the building blocks are there. Now, the way I'm going to try and persuade you that evolution has at least directionality and possibly a destination in as much as only we can understand evolution is based on 3 lines of evidence. Most of it will be about what I call evolutionary convergence, which is the thing I'm obsessed with. But I've just introduced 2 other areas more quickly. As I mentioned, Stephen Jay Gould was famous in a number of his books for arguing what happens when we rerun the tape of life. And in point of fact, this is something you can do in an experimental environment. What you have to do is take a culture of bacteria, E. coli. There are several trillion in this room, or more than trillion in this room. I won't tell you where they are in case you don't want to know. But they're there, don't you worry. If they're not, you'll be dead quite shortly. These bacteria can evolve, of course, in the normal way of mutation and rearrangement of parts of their genome. What you do is you take a population of bacteria and you allow it to begin evolving. You give it actually an evolutionary challenge. Life is sweet, you make it nasty. They have to respond. But the neat thing is you can take the ancestral population of the bacteria and freeze it here in the liquid nitrogen. So you can wake up the ancestral bacteria whenever you like and compare them with the evolved descendants. That's nice. The second thing you can do is, because you've got an enormous grant, and you can see the white coat, which shows you've got an enormous grant. You buy not one milk bottle, but you buy 12, and into each one of the milk bottles you put a culture of the bacteria. So there are 12 different lines of evolution. There are 12 histories of evolution. In one milk bottle, a cosmic ray hits a bacterium. Gotcha! Mutation, sudden new direction of evolution. And so far as we know, bacteria cannot communicate to each other from one milk bottle to the other. They can't say, how are you doing? Everything okay there? Are you evolving all right? No, da 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 da, and that sort of thing. So you can then investigate after thousands of generations what is the relative roles of history, 12 milk bottles, the relative roles of chance, that cosmic ray hitting that milk bottle, and the relative role of direction. And the results are quite interesting. Now, this is only one of many, many experiments. These are principally done by a very talented biologist in Michigan, in East Lansing, Rick Lenski. We have the starting point with the orange triangles. We have 1,000 generations here. In fact, they're now, I think, beyond 12,000 generations with these experiments. And you can see here effectively how good they are at something. I can give you the details if you're interested. It really doesn't matter. I mean, it's just maltose is a new sugar substrate which they loathe. They don't like it at all. So what we see is that the role of history becomes less and less important. History doesn't matter in this context. Chance never mattered at all. Just goes away. Yeah, sure, things happen, but of course they do. But is there any significance? No. Whereas adaptation, which of course is what neo-Darwinians understand perfectly well, becomes increasingly important. Now actually, that part of the diagram is entirely unsurprising. These are in some ways much more interesting because these are central to the argument of the contingency of life. Now the problem here, of course, is that what happens in a milk bottle may not be the same as what happens in the biosphere. Also, there are many other experiments done by this group and others, and by no means all of them come to the same conclusion. So again, it's a broad area, but overall, and there was a recent paper just published a few weeks ago, once again, it turns out that the directionality of evolution in this bacterial systems is really very, very striking indeed. Now, the second way you can look at this question is to say, well, I don't want to use the word design because it is now being illegitimately exported, but nevertheless there are arrangements of biomechanics which clearly mean that in many respects organisms are machine-like. They're not machines, but there are useful analogies with machines. And you can then say, well, given all the designs of organisms, is there any particular sort of design which ought to have evolved, just, because it's a sensible thing to do, like going around famously on wheels, but has failed to evolve? Now, so far as biology is concerned, in fact, the question as to why organisms have never evolved the wheel, with the exception, as some of you will know, of the famous bacterial flagellum, which is one of the leitmotifs of the intelligent design movement. And again, if you want to talk about this, I will, but I can assure you that they are on a hiding to nothing in this area. But with respect to the wheel, in fact, biomechanically, I think it's not problematic. It could easily evolve. The reason why wheels have not evolved on this planet is because you need a hard, flat surface. We call them roads. Wheels and technology basically go together. There are plenty of flat surfaces on this planet, especially on the ocean floor, but of course they are soft, sticky mud. Elsewhere, this planet is what we call rugged. In other words, as you'll know if you've had the misfortune either to be in a wheelchair or pushing somebody around in a wheelchair, it's extremely difficult. Even a small topography can make it very, very difficult, which is why we choose to go around on levers. We call them legs, and there's stories here, which I haven't included in today's talk, which suggest that, in fact, this is an extremely good design. And I find it quite difficult to imagine any major ecological zone which requires a particular sort of machine-like organization which has not been invented by evolution. I may be wrong, and again, I'm not going to talk about it today, but one of the small interests we have at the moment is to say, okay, let's go to other planets with life, which actually are very different from the Earth in many, many respects. They've got a thicker atmosphere, for example. I think we're now at a position where we can make reasonable predictions as to what we're going to find there, because to a considerable extent, actually the physics especially, and to a certain extent the chemistry of those environments, will constrain what is possible. But the thing which I'm most interested in, and this is work in progress, very much work in progress, is to do with what I call evolutionary convergence. Now, assuming that the majority of you are not scientists, let alone biologists, a tiny bit of background, here we can see two mammals. These are placental mammals, cow, of course, and human. When this girl grows up and becomes a woman, and if she becomes pregnant, she will have an extended gestation period, as indeed the cow does. Cow shorter than the cow, but many months where the young is kept in the womb. There's another main group of mammals known as the marsupials. And here, in fact, is a marsupial. It's a rather peculiar one. This is not a kangaroo, as you can see. Marsupials, the young is born at a much, much earlier stage. It climbs out of the vagina of the female and actually has very powerful forearms, and it really sort of, it's a bit like a rock climber. It climbs up a thing, goes into the pouch of the marsupial and attaches itself to the nipple of the mammary gland and basically fuses to that mammary gland, and then grows, in a sense, outside the womb until eventually it becomes entirely free living. So it's two sorts of mammal. Now, in this particular cat here, we can see that it's got this stabbing canine here. It's got a protective flange here. Here are the teeth which would grind up the flesh after it's being lacerated by the plunging dagger-like motion of this canine. And this is a reconstruction of that particular cat up here. There again, you can see the same flange. Now, this cat lived in South America. It's extinct. This is another saber-toothed cat. This one actually you would have found in Cambridge maybe 15,000 years ago, but it had a very wide distribution. It occurred in Asia and also in North America, and those of you who have been to the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles will have seen some magnificent specimens of this. But the point about these two saber-toothed cats is that this is a placental and this is a marsupial. In other words, this of course is closely related to the lion and to the panther, but it's also closely related to the hedgehog. In other words, this cat is more closely related to a hedgehog or a giraffe, and this cat is more closely related to a wombat or a kangaroo than they are to each other. But you can see the convergence between these is really very striking. They've come to the same solution. And there's actually nothing very surprising about this. And people do point out to me, they say, well, Simon, a wonderful example, thank you very much, but you must understand there are differences between these cats, especially in the skeleton behind the skull, the so-called postcranial skeleton. And I say, well, I'm sure you're right, but from my perspective, it is completely academic whether you were eaten by this cat or whether you were eaten by this cat. It really doesn't matter very much at all. Now, the thing with convergence is that until recently, it's been taken as an anecdotal set of examples. It's good to show that adaptation is real, because there has been a discussion in evolution as to the relative importance of adaptation. Again, Stephen Jay Gould published a great deal on this. On the other hand, there are two things I want to emphasize. First of all, just in the ordinary descriptions of evolutionary convergence, nearly always the adjectives one uses are such words as remarkable, uncanny, stunning, astonishing, which is very strange use of sort of almost words of wonder. I mean, what's so odd about convergence? You know, some things work, some things don't. I mean, it's not terribly surprising. But that, I think, actually indicates that, in a way, and again, I don't want to use the word design because I don't think it's designed in that sense at all, but nevertheless, the similarity of the solutions is very striking indeed, and goes again against the idea that evolution is simply a set of contingent accidents. The other aspect is, and again I'll try and emphasize this as I go on, actually convergence is much, much more widespread than has been appreciated, and I'll give you examples which go all the way from the molecules all the way to societies, in fact. Well, I'm going to come back not only to the eye, as I already mentioned, with those proteins, but also especially to the eye of the octopus and its relatives in just a moment. But I just thought I'd sort of step slightly sideways for a second. And these are very beautiful creatures indeed. They show a very interesting intelligence, which has some interesting similarities to mammals in various ways. But there are many, many other convergences in the octopus with other groups of vertebrates in particular. One example, for instance, is that they have quite a powerful heart. And of course, as you probably know, the vessel coming out of the heart is called the aorta. Now, if you think about this for a moment, the aorta's actually got to deal in a very interesting way with blood pressure. And if it fails, of course, then it ruptures and typically you die quite quickly. The structure of the aorta in the octopus is almost identical to the structure of your aorta, but it's not so surprising. It's a good way of designing things. In other ways, though, you would think that this is actually a very alien creature. H.G. Wells, the English science fiction writer, and other writer of many other things, was fascinated with octopuses. He always regarded them as being sort of interesting but repellent. And what could be more dissimilar to ourselves, other than the aquatic environment, than these long, flexible tentacles with these suckers on? I mean, this is something which is, if there's anything coming out of the spaceship, it's going to be looking like an octopus. Well, this may be true, but on the other hand, it turns out that if you look at the way in which these tentacles actually work to capture food, in point of fact, they are strongly convergent on our limbs, because basically what they do is they break their tentacle up into a series of pseudo joints, which are shown here with the octopus here. And the point about this, I mean, I won't go into all the details of what these graphs are actually telling you, but what effectively they're showing is that this thing is not a sort of infinitely flexible thing flopping around in the sea, grabbing at anything. It's a precisely controlled system which actually operates in a way which is remarkably similar to our jointed lever system which we use for our arms. So here too, and this is something which I think is a little bit underappreciated in convergence, one doesn't always need to be impressed by exact similarities like those saber-toothed cats. Even structures which at first sight look radically different, and I could give you an example, for instance, in the way insects walk in comparison to the way we walk, what could be more different from a human and a cockroach? Except that, basically, well actually we're not very good because we're not bipedal, better use a dog and cockroach. Actually, they basically walk in an identical fashion. So here again we have deep-seated similarities, which is simply to do with how you manage to move around on the surface of the Earth. Now, so far as biology is concerned, the main argument has been that if convergence is going to be rare, it's going to be in molecular biology. And the reason for that is because the molecules, of course, are made of a very large number of components. In DNA, the base pairs, and in proteins, the amino acids. And the likelihood of ending up with the same sort of structure is vanishingly remote. But in point of fact, this turns out not to be quite the case. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. I always like to show this one. This is a splendid, as you can all see, it's a spider, of course. It's got these interesting eyes up here. But it makes a web of sticky silk like this, and actually suspends itself from a bush, and it uses this to trap prey. And it's quite interesting what it does. This is all natural history. I think it's quite fun to learn about. They hunt at night, which actually explains why they've got these big eyes here. So they need, trying to see in the gloom. And because it's very dark beneath them, what they do is they defecate onto the area beneath them. So there's a big white splotch like that, okay? So the prey is coming along. The prey is going for an evening walk, lovely evening. And it suddenly goes into this big bright area. It gets very bright here. And of course, the next thing that happens that this thing goes down like that, puts the silk round it like that, and then goes back up into the bush like that. So, that's the end of the story so far as the prey is concerned. Dinner is served, as we say. But the point about this is that the silk has evolved independently several times in the arthropods. And not only that, but because the silk, from the point of view of engineering, is a fascinating protein. It's very, very remarkable indeed. The actual molecular structure of the silk in different groups has again converged on the same solution. So once again, when you stand back, actually that's not so surprising. I mean, when you give these examples, well, how else was it going to be? but on the other hand, it always seems to come as a surprise. But the example I want to stress in a little bit more detail, and this is not technical at all, but takes a tiny bit of explanation, is to do with a different sort of molecular convergence. Here we've got standard molecules and the DNA behind it, and here, of course, we have a background of plants. Plants, of course, photosynthesize. That is, that they take carbon dioxide, we hope as much as possible at the moment, combine it with water, using chlorophyll and sunlight, produce sugars. Now, the point is that carbon dioxide, which is necessary for carbon-based life forms, is extremely recalcitrant. It's a tough molecule. It's very well bound together. It's difficult to split apart. Carbon dioxide, of course, is not only used for photosynthesis. All of us are exhaling carbon dioxide as part of our process of respiration. Correspondingly, when we want to build our bones, our skeleton, again, you have to control in various ways the carbon dioxide. Now, the point about this is that the management of carbon dioxide is achieved by a natural catalyst. They're things we call enzymes, and the one involved is called carbonic anhydrase, and this is an example of carbonic anhydrase up here. This is an amazing molecule. It accelerates reactions by many millions of times. I won't go into all the details, because I don't know enough about how it works, but I mean the actual chemistry involves in fact an atom of zinc, as it so happens, and then 3 other amino acids around it, normally histidines. But the really important thing is that carbonic anhydrase has evolved 1, 2, 3 times. Well, no, it's actually evolved at least 5 times. And to my way of thinking, what that now suggests is that if you have carbon-based life forms which are necessarily using carbon dioxide is a universal gas. It's there on Venus, it's there on Mars, that's what you're going to find. Almost certainly you're going to be using carbonic anhydrase. I think there is now sufficient predictability about that one can say, yes, this is the molecule of choice. I think in view of the time, I was going to say a little bit about hemoglobin and hemerythrin, but I think we might, seeing how time's going on, I think I'll happily tell you about it if you're interested, but I think it'd be sensible to move on a bit. Now, just one other thing in terms of examples of convergence. I've given you some examples of molecular convergence. Not only does convergence involve societies, it even involves behavior. And this is a particularly splendid example. At least I like this one, because I'm afraid when I go home, normally I pour one of these into one of those and relax. But what happens is that if you look at the fly, Drosophila, now Drosophila is a very interesting organism, the so-called fruit fly, because it has to go to fruit to get the sugars. But of course, often the fruit ferments, and therefore the fly has to be tolerant of alcohol, because often the fermentation goes a bit further. What we see is very interesting is, in fact, that the behavioural response of flies to alcohol is remarkably similar to the behavioural response of humans to alcohol. And this is what you can see, okay? So what we're doing here is we're seeing how fast these flies are moving around. And it's just like going to a party. You have your first drink, and everybody starts to talk really quickly. Fine, a great jabber of conversation. And then things, you have a slightly stronger drink, you have a bigger gin and tonic, and it drops off markedly. Then, as you begin to get fairly drunk, you become more and more animated until a stage when you're so drunk you actually then start to become comatose, and eventually at this point you die. Now, the point about this is that in fact the genetic mechanisms of this are interestingly similar to the humans, but the names of the genes are they're quite amusing, I think so in any case, but they have such names, the genes in the fly as barfly, a cheap date, amnesiac. So here we have examples where actually even such things as alcohol tolerance or intolerance may be far more similar than you might at first expect. And those of you perhaps who've read Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe will know that he has a lot of discussion about gin and tonic and things like that. So even in cases of behaviour, we have some very interesting examples of convergence. But what I'll do now, I hope, get us more or less to halfway time, is that I'm interested in the likelihood of sentience. Even the sentient says, could I please have a gin and tonic? And in part, that's going to be originated in terms of sensory systems. And what I want to persuade you is that there are 2 very interesting aspects about sensory systems, to us principally vision, but also many other sensory systems. which themselves show, first of all, convergence within a sensory system, but also a very interesting set of convergences at a yet deeper level, which I think is really quite interesting and really quite important. So I'll start talking about the eye. Of course, so far as people like Richard Dawkins are concerned, and I agree with him entirely in this area. I don't agree with much of what he says, but I agree with him entirely in this area, that eyes are actually perfectly easy to evolve. As I've explained, the building blocks are already there. But as significantly, we can understand really quite convincingly what the evolutionary origin of the eye is from a molecular level and from the way in which it's constructed. So we are descendants of fish, and this slide, perhaps rather unfairly, I call my head of department slide. You know, you see the mad glare. You know, and you see the fleeing staff there, and you know there's a wreck behind. You know, it all makes sense, and a great deal of turbidity. You know, it does rather ring true, doesn't it? But as I mentioned, the convergence between the camera eye of the squid, the octopus, and here the cuttlefish, and our eye is indeed very, very striking indeed. Oh dear, no, it's gone back, thanks, nice. And again, from the perspective both of the fossil record and molecular biology, we know that we are actually very closely related to the starfish. I could tell you a story about that, but that would take too long at the moment. And this is very closely related to the oyster, or to the clam and the snail. And we know that from the fossil record, it is extremely unlikely that the common ancestor of these two groups, which lived round about 580 million years ago, maybe a bit less, possessed this camera eye. And you see this very nicely indeed, because here we've got the lens of an octopus, and we're shining light through it, and you can see it's beautifully focused here. And that's shown also when we compare the eye of the trout, which is an aquatic fish, of course, that's easy to make the comparison, and the octopus there. The designs are very similar. But this is actually quite interesting, and it needs a little bit of technical explanation. But basically, the light which shines round the edge of the lens tends to be a bit more bent than the light which is going through the middle of the lens. So you have a thing which is known as spherical aberration. You need to correct that. And the way you correct it is by adjusting the refractive index, the amount by which the light is bent, Snell's law, that sort of stuff. And what we see here is as you move from the centre of the lens outwards, so you change the refractive index. And there is an ideal parabola, described by these curves here. And you can see that both the octopus and the trout fall almost precisely on that same line. Now, once again, I mean, if the eye is going to work, you can't just afford to have some curve down here. You know, there's only one solution to this. But you can see that both the octopus and the trout have arrived at a strikingly similar solution to the same problem. So in cross-section, we have the octopus. This is a group we technically call the cephalopods. We belong to the vertebrates, and you can see that the structure of the eye is indeed very similar. It's a lovely example of convergence. Sometimes people will say, well, this is sort of, if you like, the thumbprint of God. But what is really important to stress is that however striking the evolutionary similarity of convergence might be, there is always a hallmark of evolution, because always a history is encoded in the final structure. And again, this is something we as evolutionary biologists take for granted, but it's sometimes forgotten by people who are misusing design arguments. And what we see here is that the red area, assuming that the males in here aren't colourblind, they'll be about 15% colourblind. So it's a matter of... Oh, no, I better not ask, because it probably infringe people's moral rights on it or something. No. Tell me afterwards. I'm not colourblind, but it's actually quite common. It's a very common genetic problem. The retina of the cephalopod is actually in the opposite position to the vertebrate. This technically is a less successful design because the light actually has to travel through another layer of cells before it can reach the retina. Well, as you can see looking around, that doesn't seem to be too much of an impediment, and it's not. The reason for this is actually quite interesting, and it is that the retina of the cephalopod eye is derived basically from the skin. So when the skin sinks inwards, that's why it has that position. Our retina is basically an outgrowth of the brain. It is actually in many ways an extension of the brain, and therefore it has that position. So there is an evolutionary stamp on these two solutions to what is otherwise remarkably similar. The other aspect to stress is that the camera eye has evolved not twice, not actually 3 times. Here's a group of worms of which the earthworm is a relative. This actually lives in the sea. Again, I'll give you the details if you're interested. But it actually has evolved something like 7 times independently. And what's very, very striking about these camera eyes is that they are found almost invariably. The one exception is a group of snails which have turned themselves into landscape artists. That's another story. Almost without exception, these are animals which move fast. They tend to hunt, they're predators, and they tend to be intelligent. That's quite an interesting combination.
Earthworms are intelligent.
What are, sorry?
Earthworms are intelligent.
Earthworms certainly are not, but the alciopids, this group here, which is the group which has evolved the camera eye, have relatively large brains, as indeed quite a few of the marine polychaetes do. And in fact, the brains of those marine polychaetes are strikingly similar to the arthropods, and we don't know nearly enough about them. And those ones there, I would think, would be, nobody's done any psychological tests on an alciopid worm, but I bet you anything that it's actually a pretty smart animal. It's a fast pelagic hunter, and you can't do those sorts of things unless you're able to live in a coordinated 3-dimensional environment. But no, that's a perfectly fair question. There are a lot of things we don't know about supposedly simple animals. The general idea is that they're not stupid. Earthworms actually probably are more intelligent than we give them credit for, but you know, they have taken a particular mode of life, and the ganglia of the earthworm is really relatively small. I know, I've dissected many of them. Is that okay? Is that a reasonable answer? I'm sorry about that. I'll try and slow down even more. Absolutely, yes. I'll have to be invited again. Or buy the tape. Another sort of eye which is very widespread is the compound eye. And here we can see a classic example in an insect. Now, the compound eye has evolved independently at least 4 times. But it shows some interesting design limitations in as much as effectively you want to collect as much light as you can. Therefore, you close pack the lenses. You have this lovely hexagonal close packing. It's very beautiful. In addition, you make the surface as hemispherical as possible, so you maximize the surface area of the thing. And you also make as many lenses as you can. But if you make the lens individually too small, then you won't be able to trap enough light. So there's an upper limit to the amount of light which this eye in the insect can collect. And a nice thought experiment by a German physiologist, Kuno Kirschfeld, who works in Tübingen, said, okay, camera eyes are verboten. They are no longer allowed, you know. And everybody must now have, you know, the compound eye. What size of eye would we require to enjoy the visual acuity of our eyes which we presently possess? And the answer is pretty sobering. It's not too good at all. You'd need a huge eye. So here again, I think that not only will extraterrestrial astronomers, they must use camera eyes. But if extraterrestrials were ever to arrive on this planet, you know, all fanning out of the thing with laser guns, you know, usual stuff, and, you know, with these empathy-free compound eyes. No, not at all of it. They'll be looking at us with camera eyes. You know, they'd be falling over their shoes, literally, if they tried to, you know, get around with that thing. Compound eyes are very effective at a certain size, at certain distances for certain animals. They're a very good solution. No problem with them. But I don't think you're going to find them in advanced sentient creatures. And this examples of convergence actually go much, much deeper. I was talking about the way that fruit flies get drunk, but as you can see from this diagram here, and as you can read, as touch, tactile, taste from your tongue, sight from your eyes, smell through your noses, hearing through your ears, returned on their charter flight, Mr. Man knew that finally he was human again. In other words, we have a much wider range of sensory environments than we sometimes recognize, but as much each one of these is also convergent. They have a different basis, but they do the same thing. And this is shown in a number of ways. This is actually quite interesting. There are a number of ways we can approach this. For example, this of course is a close relative of us. This is a rat. But it's now been shown that in point of fact, just as we see with binocular vision and stereo vision using our 2 eyes, rats smell in stereo. In other words, They have air coming in one nostril and the other nostril, and those nostrils are only 1.5 millimeters apart, and yet there are different airflows, and that information is integrated inside the brain of the rat to provide an analogue of a stereo image. Now, if you think about this for a minute, it's not so surprising, because there are many other interesting examples of sensory perception which at first sight look almost alien, but in point of fact have similarities. I was going to say remarkable similarities, but why say remarkable? So in the star-nosed mole, this is a North American species of mole, and I could say some very interesting things about the convergence of the digging mammals. But here we have the nostrils. These are used for smelling, but the surrounding area, as you can see, is modified into these long tentacles, which in point of fact are extremely flexible, but they are also extremely sensitive to touch, fantastically sensitive to touch. 5 times more nerves go from this small nose to the brain than go from our hand to our brain. And there's a very interesting story about the detailed structure of these tentacles. But what's really interesting is that the basic neurobiology of the nervous system from the nose, from the sensory part of the nose, from the tactile part of the nose, is remarkably convergent with the way in which we see. In other words, as Ken Catania, the American scientist who's worked on this mole for a number of years, this is a mole which uses its nose as an eye. Now, of course, it's not using it as an eye to see in 3 dimensions. But again, if you think about it, what are we... And again, this is something we're going to start talking about Kant if we're not careful, but this is a general thing about how do we actually make any sense of the outside world at all? Well, we do it by sense perceptions, at least in part. But there's nothing out there. Well, it depends what your view of philosophy is, but there's nothing actually out there. Everything is being made sense of inside our brain by photons being made into an electrical signal. We can do other tests, but well, it's another story. But in essence, there's no reason why an animal can't make just as good sense of its environment through its nose by touch as we can through our eyes. It will not have 3-dimensionality. You would say at first sight, well, it does not have colour, but even that may not be true. Because when we go to other environments which are in some ways more alien to us, that is the aquatic environments, we find that a number of groups of fish have learnt how to generate an electrical field around them. What they do is they modify some of the muscles into electrically generating cells, and necessarily they have other cells which are able to pick up the electrical signal. Now, why do they do this? Well, this is an example, the name makes perfectly good sense, the so-called elephant nose fish, the mormarids. This lives in Africa. And it lives in effectively dark water. It's typically nocturnal. And yet this fish can navigate effortlessly in total darkness because it's made an electrical field around itself, and as the electrical field is distorted, so it is able to read the environment around it. And of course, not only can they navigate around inanimate objects, but they also communicate with the other fish. If you go to South America, there's another group of fish, they're called the gymnotids, which have almost no evolutionary connection to these fish in Africa. But they have converged on basically the identical system of electrical generation and electrical reception. And this can be shown particularly elegantly because the way they actually make the electrical waveform is actually not the same. One is a pulse, one is a waveform. But if you are beside another fish and you both produce exactly the same electrical signal at exactly the same moment, of course you'll cancel each other out. Well, that's useless because it defeats the purpose. It's like jamming radar. So what they have is a system whereby they can shift the waveform very, very quickly. And this is a thing known as jamming avoidance reaction. It's the sort of thing a radar person would say. You know, if you're trying to jam your thing, you try and move your signal so you get out of the jamming zone. And the algorithm, the equation they use for the jamming avoidance in South America is identical to the one they use in Africa, because that's the way you have to do it. And of course, it has another side to it, because sometimes you don't want to avoid jamming, you want to jam your competitors. So there are also examples of sexual competition, where you deliberately jam the other person. You know, I can't hear you, honey, I really can't hear you. Sorry, I have to speak up. And, of course, you know, the rivals there, you know, some twiddling thing like that. Very naughty indeed. Quite wicked. But not only do you get the sense that these animals live in an electrical world, but there have even been arguments that they have something analogous to colour in terms of the electrical perception. And another very fascinating aspect of this sensory perception is that, as well as the convergences one gets, so that in the dolphin, which I'll come back to in the second half of this morning's talk, they have echolocation, which is convergent with the bats, of course. But you can show using experiments whereby you can block their vision in a perfectly non-harmful way, that somehow they seem to be able to combine the image, whatever that means, of echolocation with the image from the eye. So they are living in a sensory world which perhaps in some ways is actually richer than ours, and it's necessary because if you put little discs on their eyes, they can identify an object as small as that on the tank floor just using echolocation. So again, one just wants to step a little bit back about exactly how it is we make sense of our world. And I think there are quite interesting philosophical problems here, because this goes back to a huge amount of philosophical discussion, which I'm no expert on at all, as to what the nature of the sense data might be. And why does all this matter in the end? Well, I think it matters partly because these are fascinating examples of convergence. They are remarkable. Be you talking about the taste, which I didn't talk about, or the hearing, which I didn't talk about. Basically, a fly tastes in the same way as we do. A mosquito hears in the same way as we do. The organs are basically completely different. The genes are different, but the basic molecular mechanism is the same. That's the way you do it. But more significantly, it is the thought that, is it really the case that mental processes in other animals are so very different from ours? And the reason this has attracted a lot of attention goes back to a famous essay by Thomas Nagel on what is it like to have the mind of a bat. And he said, well, we'll never know. It's completely alien. I mean, think about it. You want to be a bat, you make yourself the size of a mouse, you grow leathery wings, you hang upside down in an attic, you squeak, you echolocate. These are things which we could imagine in a way, but we will never be able to enter the mind of the bat. But if it turns out that these sensory processings are much more similar than had been thought, then potentially we might be able to understand the minds of other animals. But even more importantly, if these convergences are in fact as striking as they appear to be, it begins to suggest that the mental processes anywhere in the universe ought to be effectively the same. And that, in some ways, should be very encouraging indeed. After all, if it turns out that you can only walk in a couple of ways, if it turns out you can only see in a couple of ways, it may turn out that you can only think in a couple of ways. So again, there's been an argument, and even if we could contact an extraterrestrial, assuming we wanted to, it might be very unwise, but assuming we wanted to, it's far from clear that they would really be as alien as you would imagine because of these deep-seated similarities. Right, I think, Dennis, probably a good idea to stop because we're just on 10. Is that okay? And then this will tantalise you for the second half and so forth. Would that be all right? Fine. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Elisa. I'll come over here so I'm out of the way. Good, so time for questions now. It's over to you. Question down here, yes.
Thanks so much for
I'm so sorry.
Thanks so much for this astonishing speech, which doesn't converge on anything but I see problem. I would like to ask you two things. Michael Denton had an article about the inverted retina, and he said that it's inverted because it needs enormous amounts of oxygen, and the oxygen is found at the backside of blood vessels.
Right.
And so on. So does it also, I mean, is it in line with your explanation, or, I mean, it's not a historical explanation. Like it doesn't say it has a history as a skin, but maybe it was a more of a design kind of thing.
I can answer that straight away because I can answer it very simply by saying I don't know. The reason is what I don't know is what the blood plexus is at the back of the cephalopod eye. In the cephalopods, they have a closed blood system, unlike the other mollusks. They actually use a different respiratory protein, which is a nice example of convergence as it happens. And I simply don't know what the plexus of the blood would be. But the answer will be that whatever is needed will be supplied. And the interesting thing about evolution is that you, by and large, find that there's what we in English call a jury-rig system, whereby, however improbable it might be from an engineering viewpoint, rest assured the retina will get the blood it needs for the very simple reason if it doesn't, it can't function. So the basic difference is to do with the embryology. It's where does the retina actually derive from? It may well be that actually that it's really difficult to know whether the cephalopod eye is any worse than a vertebrate eye. I mean, such tests you can do, they're just about identical, and they're also just about as perfect as we think we could make them. But what I can't answer precisely is what is the blood arrangement in the cephalopod eye. I simply don't know.
And one more thing.
Thank you for that. In any case, sorry to be so useless.
Well,
It's a,
no, you're not. Definitely. And well, you said eyes are pretty easy to evolve, and I mean that's the way you think. Well, Michael B. he doesn't agree, and because he thinks that the retinal machinery, the biochemical machinery in the cells, are irreducibly complex, and as he argues, the same thing for the bacterial flagellum.
Indeed.
I mean, you mentioned that, so I would like to learn more about your take on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No. I'll start very briefly with the bacterial flagellum. This, of course, is a cause célèbre, as they say, in terms of the argument for intelligent design. There are many reasons for thinking that's not going to work. It's first of all because it's basically, I mean, speaking very broadly, it's a gaps argument, and gaps arguments in science are very, very risky indeed. There are lots of things we didn't understand 50 years ago and seem to be irreducibly complex we now understand rather well. More importantly is that certainly we don't know how the bacterial flagellum is constructed in terms of the origin of the various proteins, but we do know that some of the proteins have other functions, and therefore they are readily recruited for this function. And that is equally true as the example I gave for the eyes and the structure of the proteins in the lens. Those lens proteins are recruited principally from bacteria where they are used for stress control. And there's very good reasons why we're going to use those particular proteins. They're very stable. They're just what you need if you want to have an eye which can see for 80 years and so forth. More importantly, with regard to the bacterial flagellum, though, is that if you go to the other group of bacteria known as the archaea, rather than the so-called eubacteria, which includes E. coli, in the archaea they also have a flagellum, a rotary flagellum, which is convergent on the rotary flagellum which Bihé makes such a song and dance about. And in detail, actually, it's not that similar. The protein structure is not particularly similar. They do basically the same thing. But the thing which is strikingly similar in the two groups of the bacteria, as you probably know, you've got this sort of housing thing which allows the thing to rotate. I mean, it is an amazing molecular machine. It's absolutely astonishing. But the construction of that housing is basically identical, because that's the way it's got to work. So, if you've got a convergent example, you say, well, this is kind of strange. Well, maybe it's because bacteria have to move, and maybe they have to move by evolving bacterial flagella, and maybe they recruit the proteins they need to make a flagellum. So, and maybe we need to see, so we recruit the proteins we need. Is it so different, the argument? I don't think so. So, no, I don't think it's irreducibly complex at all. We certainly don't understand its construction in detail, but that's what interests scientists. And for the eye, again, it's a thought experiment, but we do know, even if you look amongst living animals, you actually get all gradations of eyes. You see this very nicely in the mollusks. Some mollusks basically have little more than a sensitive patch of cells, which are sensitive to light. Other mollusks have different sorts of eyes, which ultimately, in some groups of snails in particular, actually have evolved a camera eye. So you have a whole gradation of forms. And correspondingly, if you do the thought experiment, which was done rather nicely, and I'm sorry, I could have put the slide in, the thought experiment just saying, well, what is an eye? An eye basically is a patch which is transparent with sensory cells underneath. At its simplest, that's the eye spot. If you want to evolve that into a fully functioning camera eye and assume that there is an adaptive advantage in each step, that is an assumption. But it seems to be that, after all, if you live in a competitive world, it really is helpful to see more clearly than your predators, for example, or your prey. Then the transformation into a fully fledged camera eye can be achieved effectively by something like 1,000 unremarkable steps. And in terms of geological time, that can be easily done in less than 1 million years. Easily done. And so you have to say, well, if you've got an eye spot, if you've got a camera eye, is it so difficult to imagine that there's a series of intermediate forms which connect them? Not least because you can see many of those intermediate forms in living creatures. Eyes don't fossilise very well, unfortunately. There's a brilliant story in trilobites, but that's a brilliant story, but it's a slightly different thing. So I don't see the problem there, but maybe I'm not addressing the point you're trying to get to.
Well, actually, thank you. I mean, the point was saying, I would, in general, would say, why can we easily dismiss a very complex system, and I mean the design argument for a complex system, by saying, well, this is a God of the gaps argument? I mean, wouldn't it be like when we see the Stonehenge, we say, well, it was designed. We don't say, well, it's a humans of the gaps argument to think that. I mean, that. So maybe some things are designed. I mean, how can we in advance decide that none of them are designed, and then think that we see a complex thing? Well, we shouldn't be making the God of the gaps argument. So I mean, if that's a philosophical start, but if we don't, if we give a chance that there might be indeed gaps, so maybe we might be open to the design hypothesis. I mean, that's just that's one idea.
Yeah, no, and the Stonehenge one is routinely used by the Intelligent Design Brigade, and they're not a community; they're a brigade. But of course, nobody's disputing it was designed to start with. Nobody's sort of saying it was delivered by extraterrestrials, except a few freaks. And it's got a very precise set of arrangements, which are arguably of astronomical significance. And it is designed by sentient creature who are able to live extrasomatically. And we can argue, where does that extrasomatic sense come from? And I'm very happy to talk about that. But in terms of general evolutionary structures, one can say, well, that's very interesting. We've got three structures which are designed, and we've got thousands of other structures which patently aren't designed. And we'll say, well, it's a very funny sort of design argument, because how come we can explain the origin of the eye, but so far we can't explain completely the origin of the bacterial flagellum? But with respect, I think you're really trying to conflate two separate arguments there. And I think the worst of this, the thing which I object most strongly to, is, and this is inevitable given the restrictions of anybody's language, is that such things as this little boy here, at one level, are of course designed. I mean, they're more than machines, as I emphasized. But on the other hand, I think that the evidence for this being a product of evolution is about as I'll show you later on, is reasonably strong as you can imagine. But what I find so crippling about the intelligent design people, from my own perspective, is not only the misuse and the hijacking and now the inability to use the word design because it has all these additional connotations. But if you want to say, well, how is it that carbonic anhydrase, how is it that crystallines, how is it that the smell sense actually operate from a molecular and a genetic viewpoint? How are these things actually integrated? Then indeed, as I think you can see with convergence, the number of possibilities is much more limited. This ability for instance, a molecular factor we call a cell to operate at one level is, and I'm not meaning this in the way which some people might take comfort from, but from one level is almost miraculous. It's an astonishing piece of construction. And if you want to take a much, much broader view, and we may come back to this later on, either at the end of this morning's discussions or possibly this evening, and sort of say, well, what sort of universe is it we live in which allows sentient creatures to evolve, which are exceedingly complex and also exceedingly beautiful? Then one can sort of say, well, this is a reflection of something which is in its own way a matter of infinite goodness, and that would be a perfectly legitimate theological argument. But if you want to go around, as some people want to do, I think, these days, and effectively say, well, this infinite goodness, we can call him God if that helps people, is actually basically a sort of engineer who spends his time wandering around planets looking at bacteria and say, oh, well, they need a flagellum, better give them one, here we go, whoa, just like that. I mean, it's such a crippled view of the way the universe operates, because it's just sort of taking these particular exceptions. And as I've said in other contexts elsewhere, and I don't mean to offend you in this area, but my view with the intelligent design area, which I think is what you're most interested in terms of these questions, is that it's treating God effectively as an engineer. It's replacing the metaphorical huge white beard with a huge white coat. And I think it's entirely symptomatic of a particular society which has become obsessed with technocratic success. It's exactly the sort of misunderstanding you'd expect from people who sort of, are more or less geek-like, always in their computers, so these sort of tiny programs. And it's just turning their back on reality. So I think it's the theology of intelligent design which I think is so flawed. It's very appealing. You can see why it is, because it does actually answer to some people's sort of sense of the wonder, the sense of the extraordinary nature of these things. But the problem is that as and when it is scientifically disproved, then you've lost some of your troops. Because, well, if you didn't win that argument, maybe the other arguments aren't worth listening to. I think you're just exposing yourself unnecessarily to a completely unnecessary argument.
We'll probably come back to that, but let's go over this side. Yes, in the front row here. Yeah, we need the mic over here.
If I may, I'd like to follow up a little bit the structure of part of your response to this question. You mentioned, if I got this right, that the flagellum in the archaea is convergent with that of the eubacteria, which is what Beatty talks about.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. Now, and this is this helps to show, as you understand things, that the flagellum in the eubacteria is not irreducibly complex. Could you
No,
elaborate
well,
on the structure of the argument?
because
That's
it would be...
I'm just a physicist.
No.
I just don't understand the argument.
Sure. It's a perfectly it's a very fair question. It's the extent to which you get irreducible complexity in one structure. Why can't you, in a sense, extend that argument to a comparable structure? Well, you could, but what one can say is that, so far as we understand the molecular structure of the archaeal flagellum, and I'm not an expert in this, so I can give you the literature on it very easily, and I was reading one of the papers quite recently. Overall, that thing is effectively functioning in an identical fashion, but actually in detail its structure is really rather different. Now, if it turned out that if it turned out that the archaea, and we know quite a lot about their evolution, if they had a flagellum motor which was otherwise identical to what you find in E. coli, I would be suspicious. That would be strange. There are ways you can explain it from the point of view of evolution by transferring genetic information. It's not impossible, but the fact of the matter is the archaea have their own evolutionary history, and they've got their own solution. And the solution has various molecular differences to the other solution, but nevertheless, the overall function is strikingly similar. And therefore, one says, well, is this not just how evolution is going to operate? I mean, you could use the same argument for the eye. I mean, the fact of the matter is, from the cephalopod, the proteins it uses in its lens are completely different from the proteins we use in our lens. But as I showed you with the refractive index, they operate in almost an identical fashion. But nobody would say that's an example, I think, now of irreducible complexity. Why? Simply because we know where the proteins came from in the case of the cephalopod, and we know where the proteins came in the case of the vertebrates. So, you have plenty of good evolutionary examples. Certainly the story is incomplete. Nobody imagines we've got everything sorted out in this particular area. But I think, in fact, that the very existence of convergence is encouraging in some ways, because it does suggest that there are a limited number of options of moving around at a very low Reynolds number environment, which is where a bacterium lives, but correspondingly, one will expect to see the thing operate some ways superficially in the same way, but effectively identically.
Can you just explain Reynolds number?
Oh, sorry. Reynolds numbers is just is a relationship between the viscosity and the characteristic length of an organism. So we live in high Reynolds numbers, so we live in a turbulent environment, so does the jet aircraft. Bacteria live at a much lower Reynolds number, and in that particular case they are dominated by so-called viscous forces, and they live in a non-turbulent environment, and the usual not explanation, normal description of this is that when a bacterium stops swimming, its distance across which it stops is equivalent to the diameter of a hydrogen atom. So it is a completely different world from the world that we live in. And that's the way that the flagellum works in that world. Yeah.
May I follow that up?
Okay, you can come back. What do you do? Yes.
Okay. I was hoping I could maybe summarize in small words, but I think I understood your response to be to see if I got it right. The idea is that the flagellum of the archaean bacteria is somewhat different, though also similar, and that's suggestive that the construction or whatever, the design of the flagellum of the bacteria could be somewhat different and still work, and therefore plausibly isn't irreducibly complex. Is that?
No, it's got nothing directly to do with complexity, and in the same way as the eye of the squid is somewhat different from the eye of ourselves, but they're otherwise convergent. In other words, they both achieve the same function. And what one's interested in is, how does the thing function? What is its evolutionary origins? And we don't. I think, in fact, we know less about the evolutionary origins of the archaeal flagella than we do of the eubacterial flagellum. But the fact that they're convergent suggests that it's a jolly good solution, And the fact they've got, in many ways, completely different proteins is exactly what you'd expect from evolution, because evolution will recruit whatever it needs. And of course, then, with the previous question, one then is entitled to stand back and say, well, isn't it an interesting universe we live in such a way that proteins can be recruited to drive a bacterium through a low Reynolds number existence? Isn't it an interesting universe we live in whereby proteins can be recruited to enable us to see or to smell, for example? But that's a different sort of question from, the sort of engineering analogy whereby this thing is supposedly irreducibly complex. It's not irreducibly complex at all. It's a completely false metaphor, and he should know better.
Okay, let's have the mic over here on this side. We're going to swap between sides so we can have a chance to. Yeah.
If there were creatures with eyes that were permanently shut off from light in darkness, would the eye de-evolve? Would they have no more need for it?
Normally, if you look at the fish which have invaded cave environments or the mammals which live underground, again, I could give you other examples of those. Yes, to the first approximation, they lose either partially or completely their eyesight. On the other hand, in fact, in a number of cases, some remnant of the eye is retained, and it's probably retained because it's part of the so-called circadian cyclicity. In other words, the sort of the ancestry of the light-darkness cycle. So it may still need that molecular motor for being able to go through its cyclicity, even though it never sees the daylight. But yes, eyes are generally lost, which it makes sense. I mean, eye is an expensive object to maintain. The only thing one could say beyond that, though, is that actually some sensory systems, some eye systems, are incredibly, they still work at amazingly low light levels. And there's a whole story about nocturnal vision, for instance, which is very interesting indeed.
Do you think the world of conscious experience is very much different in congenitally blind people?
That's a good question. The question, if you didn't hear it, is not knowing any. I know a couple of blind people, as I'm sure we all do, but is the sensory world of the blind person very different? It's a difficult question because quite a lot of blind people have had some sight at some stage of their life. Not, quite often in children, they will, if they have a degenerative condition, then they have a memory at least of that. My understanding is no. I mean, no. There are some blind people use a sort of echolocation. It's not a terribly sophisticated one, but there have been some interesting experiments done in that sort of area. And certainly, thinking of people like our politician David Blunkett, for example, and I know another individual. I do not want to be blind. I love the vision I have, but one has to observe that these people can be extremely clever at manipulating other people. And what they do is that actually you forget that in a way, because you're using other senses. I mean, I unfortunately have rather good vision, and not vision, very bad vision, but rather good hearing, as it so happens. And I can often hear conversations over long distance, and the other people don't realise I can hear them. And it can be quite embarrassing, in fact. It's just, now these are great things which work. So I get, obviously there are substitutions in some way, and because vision is such a gift, I would be. There's always a discussion. If you had to lose one sense, which one would you be most willing to lose? It's a horrible question, but most people do say vision. They may be wrong, actually. Probably hearing, I think, is probably more important in that sense.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
Tagore was asked this question and he said that he would prefer losing
Yes,
eyesight.
that's right. But the other thing we do know with some rather nasty vivisection experiments is that, in point of fact, very early in the development of, for instance, ferrets and so forth, if you blind them, then in point of fact, other parts of the brain will take over more of that sensory responsibility as well. So things can, in fact, in a way, you can augment part of your sensory world if you lose some other part of your sensory world.
And when they identify the objects of the people, they use touch or hearing, the sounds. So the brain of the blind people, particularly the congenitally blind people, do you think that their hearing cortex or the sensory cortex is very different from the...
I don't know, I'm afraid. My guess is they would be, but my guess is that some part of the visual centres would then be, recruited by other parts of the sensory area. Yes.
And it has been shown.
It has. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I should know these things, but yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I think we want to go over that side of the room. There was some question over there. I think, was it Peter? Or not? Have I got it wrong? Oh, it's you. Yes, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the relationship between this divergent kind of evolution, which is what those of us who are not in your field see as evolution. Everything seems to be getting different as we go down. That's the way. Now, quite rightly, in terms of these specific things, you're showing us how there's a convergence. So you then say to yourself, now, how is evolution, is it operating at different levels? Because you seem to have both of these things going on.
Sure.
And then you say, oh, well, perhaps have people been studying how these interact with these different levels? In other words, so could you try to pull it together? Because you've been pushing the line, there's lots of good examples. So clearly we have to accept that there is a convergence, and that certainly fits in with one's knowledge of the world and the way people get to the same objective by different routes.
Sure.
So I can understand that. But that's not the way we're sold evolution. You go to school, it's sold as divergency.
No, certainly. Thank you, Dennis. The question is broadly, how can one reconcile the convergence I've been emphasising versus the simple observation of the world around us, which is highly divergent. You know, it's giraffes and hummingbirds and seaweeds and that sort of thing. And I think there are effectively a number of ways one can answer that, but there's also some major questions as to what are the convergences between different levels of biology, any case. You know, if one's interested in societies, one can study those as an expert, but if you're a molecular biologist, you probably don't read papers on that, but there are examples of convergence. But on the other hand, somewhere there is a molecular basis for societies. I mean, obviously it's not a simple one-to-one. I'm not a reductionist at all, but even so, there are connections. But my view of it is that effectively, whatever group you want to look at, it will be convergent in one way or another with another. So, if, for instance, you think about the walking I was giving you the example of, you know, if you look at the way mammals walk, basically the whole process of walking is very, very similar to the way insects walk. And this includes their neurobiology in particular. And the reason why this is so important, of course, is it's not suddenly, but it's dawned in the last few years on people who are designing robotic systems, that it's just a waste of time trying to do it from from the beginning. You find out what the wiring system is in an insect or in a mammal, and then apply that to a robot. But the problem is that actually, effectively, those animals have, are sort of 4 or 5 times more complicated than any robot is in terms of its ability to walk in an unremarkable fashion. And then the other thing, which I hope will come a little bit clearer after coffee, is that if you then look at the emergence of sentience and intelligence in particular, ultimately, I think it's a legitimate question to say, well, how likely is that emergence on any planet, and what happens when that happens, if you like? What are the consequences of that? And what one has is effectively the development of technologies, and technologies in the very widest sense. I'm not just thinking of aircraft and ships and all that sort of business. And if that's the case, then it really doesn't matter at all, where you come from, because you're then effectively making yourself a completely new world in not only in an extra-somatic way, but also almost certainly in the way of thinking about things in a completely different way. And then when that happens, all bets are off. So, yeah, I mean, the world is large, it's beautiful, it's full of the most remarkable things. I'm all in favour of it, and the fact there are billions of beetles, perfectly fine, that's part of the beauty of the world. But on the other hand, there is a deeper pattern to it.
Okay, well, we're over here. The mic next door. Yeah.
Query about bacteria. You were talking about your surprise of 2 billion years of single-celled life before anything more complex happened.
Yep.
Is it not true that the development of new proteins is extremely difficult, and actually you have these extraordinary crystallins or light-sensitive things? It may be needed 2 billion years, and they were somehow, and single-cell bacteria can evolve much faster than anything else. I may be preempting something.
Not at all. No. I hadn't planned to return to that area specifically. I don't think that's the case, in fact, for various reasons. Not least is that you can do various sorts of thought experiments on the evolution of proteins, and in its own way it can happen really very quickly indeed. It's not there is a question, of course, as to how many stable sorts of proteins are there, because if you think about the fact that you've got, well, the argument is now 23, but you've got about 20 amino acids, and a typical protein might have, let us say, 800 amino acids. So the number of alternative combinations is it's not astronomically large. It's super astronomically large. It's ludicrously big numbers. And so again, an argument some intelligent design people like to say is, well, you can't possibly navigate. Fred Hoyle's old argument. You just need, an eternity upon an eternity even to make a simple protein. Well, the fact of the matter, evolution doesn't work that way at all. It can co-opt, it can jury-rig, it can have a simple system first, which then can evolve to another system. What interests me about convergence, which I think is relatively neglected, is what are those islands, if you like, of stability. That's why the carbonic anhydrase is convergent, because the carbonic anhydrase, the basic molecular scaffolding in the 5 groups, is completely different. And there may be a reason, I wouldn't be surprised if there is, but I don't know of a reason why in a particular context it has a particular scaffolding. But I would be quite happy to accept that as a historical accident. It really doesn't bother me. What matters is that you've got the zinc atom and you've got the 3 amino acids, and that you have to have. Actually, there is one alternative. You can use another ion, another cation in one case, but that's the structure. Okay, and then you have to say, well, is it so difficult to get a zinc atom and 3 amino acids together to break down, to hydrate carbon dioxide? I don't think so. But that's the way it's done. And then you are entitled to stand back and say, well, what's so special about zinc? Is there something about zinc in biological systems which we've actually overlooked? Now, that's a perfectly legitimate question. But I don't myself think that the amount of time you need, because if you took, I'm not saying for a moment you're saying this, but if you were to take the literal view, the 2 billion years is but a weekend in the time you would need. And I think it's probably environmental, in fact. I think it's probably due to surface temperature. But there are other possibilities. But I don't think it's simply the sheer time you need to take the sheer time you need to make those particular proteins. That would be my own take. There's a nice paper written by a colleague of ours, not by him, but drew my attention up in Edinburgh, arguing, I think convincingly, that it's not particularly problematic to make proteins which function. You don't actually explore all areas of design space. It's not necessary to do that.
Okay, I think we'll have one more question, then we'll break for coffee. Just as the last one.
I think that the core of your arguments and evolution in general is that we are inferring evolution based on homology, even of fossils or living beings of other. So I think we should ask here a philosophical maybe question. Is it legitimate that we say that the only way of inferring the only thing that we can infer of the homology is evolution? Because even in the Aristotelian type classification of animal, in the Linnaeus taxonomy and in all others, homology was based. They were all based in the homology. But they didn't infer evolution of that homology. So I think the way why we infer, in general, why it is said that the only way is to infer evolution of the homology is we are getting a priori a naturalistic view. When we get a priori a naturalistic view, we don't have any other way, because that ontology cannot show us another way how we can interpret that homology. But from a theistic ontology, we have both ways, I think, because I don't think that theistic belief will force us to refute evolution. But theistic ontology can explain homology in terms of some archetypes in the mind of God, or something like a Platonic idea, or something like an Aristotelian maybe goal. That's in general, maybe it will be long. And I think one more thing, I think that you said that evolution don't go that way for protein, some probabilities. But as far as I know, Darwinian evolution works when something can give some advantages, and the natural selection process then begins. So I think the probability calculations are made when a protein can fulfill their activities in the cell. So, but if we say that we take up there is evolutionary process of a protein to fulfill its function, and as I understand of your speaking, evolutionary process began before it. So how can we put their natural selection with when a protein is not working?
You've asked 2 very big questions, and I'll try and deal with them now. It may be that we need to return to them in more detail in due course. The argument to do with homology is effectively that from an evolutionary viewpoint, we are persuaded that the flipper of the dolphin, the wing of a bat, and the human hand are all the same, because they are all built on the same arrangement of bones, albeit in a bat the fingers are very elongate, albeit in the case of the dolphin the whole thing is encased in a flipper. That's fine and large. It would be tempting to say, well, there is an archetype of the vertebrate limb which happens to be built in this particular way. And from one perspective, I don't actually have any particular quarrel with archetypes per se, and I'm more than happy to imagine that in the mind of God all these things are, for want of a better word, prefigured. I don't think that would be particularly unorthodox. The point of the matter, though, is that if I'm interested in the origin of the flipper of the whale, we have specific historical evidence in the fossil record which allows us to trace, not completely, but to trace with some degree of accuracy what the transformation was from an animal living on the seashore, which had a leg little different from that of a dog, to the flipper which we now see in the ocean-going animal. So in other words, there are intermediate forms, each one of which lived in space and time.
But I think that all these evidences are again inferring evolution of homology.
It does, yes.
Because we cannot observe that process.
Well, you can't.
Unobservable and
Well, you say. Well, you beg the question about what observation is. I mean, if I regard observation as being in a museum and seeing a set of bones laid out on a tray, I mean that seems to be observation. The fact that it had to be dug out of the sediment doesn't in any way negate their observation, as far as I can see. You can always say that interpretation is incorrect. That's a perfectly legitimate sense, but as I say, you know, I think the homologies are such that the similarities are very interesting. If they have a shared ancestry, that's fine. Actually, I'm more interested in what are called the homoplases, in other words, examples of convergence, where in point of fact what you're looking at is the things which have completely different starting points and end up with the same arrangement. Those actually seem to me to be more interesting in that thing. I mean, homology is part and parcel of evolution. But certainly if you want to stand back and take, you know, as you say, either a sense of Aristotelian form or more attractively to me, an idea of Platonic archetypes, I mean, they are deeply appealing concepts. And if indeed you're trying to say, well, as perhaps George Ellis was explaining yesterday, heaven knows, I mean, he's an expert in an area I know very little about, that one, as I was trying to indicate with the previous discussion, one is trying to deal with a structured universe which makes sense and which we can make sense of, then one is very welcome, and in fact I would entirely encourage to take a theistic perspective. But if, in my view, you try and take those arguments down to the operation of the world itself, and then say, well, these things are simply the archetypes, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but some people certainly do say this, that somehow evolution doesn't happen, then I have to say, well, I'm afraid we have sufficient